At 74 years old, Margaret Sullivan sat in the sterile, air-conditioned silence of a law office and watched her 4 children sign the documents that would freeze her life in place. But what those 4 grieving heirs didn't know, what they were too blinded by their own greed to see, is that their father had anticipated this betrayal before the ink on his original will was even dry. This is the story of a woman who lost every penny she helped earn, only to find a secret weapon hidden in plain sight. If you've ever felt the cold sting of betrayal from the people you raised, if you've been told you are too old to understand your own value, or if you've watched someone you love turn into a stranger over a bank balance, this story is for you. Subscribe now and stay until the final minute, because the contents of the sealed envelope the family solicitor is holding will prove that justice never ever gets the address wrong. The room smelled of expensive leather and floor wax. Margaret, known as Maggie to everyone but the lawyers, kept her back straight. She wore a charcoal grey wool coat that had seen better winters. It was the same coat she had worn to her husband Arthur's funeral 3 months ago. Across the mahogany table, her eldest son Stephen adjusted his gold watch. He didn't look at her. None of them did. Linda was busy checking her phone. Mark and Chloe whispered to each other in the corner. They were already dividing a kingdom they hadn't built. Maggie reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers brushed against a heavy silver compass. The metal was cold. The glass face was slightly scratched. Arthur had given it to her on their first anniversary, back when they lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above a bakery. He told her she was the only one who could ever find the way home. For 50 years, she had been his navigator. She had been 22 years old when she closed her own ledger for the last time to open his. She sat at a pine kitchen table every night for 4 decades and tracked every shipment. When the company grew and moved into glass towers, she remained in the shadows of the accounting department. She wore the same winter coat for 12 years so the children could have the best university tutors and summer camps. She never drew a formal paycheck because she believed a family was a single unit with a single heart. She had managed the payroll for 500 employees while her own children were in diapers. She had balanced the books during the recession when Arthur couldn't sleep. She had negotiated the contracts that turned a 3-truck operation into a multi-million-dollar empire. She did all of this while making sure there was a hot meal on the table every night at 6 o'clock. She never asked for her name on the deeds. She never asked for a seat on the board. She thought her contribution was written in the walls of their home and the success of her children. She was wrong. The family solicitor, Mr. Vance, cleared his throat. He looked at Maggie with a kindness that felt like a sharp blade. He had been Arthur's friend for 30 years. He knew the truth of how the money was made, but he also knew the law. The children had filed an emergency injunction. They claimed Maggie was no longer capable of managing the estate. They cited memory lapses that didn't exist. They pointed to her frugal habits as signs of a declining mind. Because she still clipped coupons and walked to the grocery store, they argued she was unfit to hold the keys to the kingdom. Stephen leaned forward. He used the caring voice he usually reserved for television interviews. He said they were just being realistic. He told her she couldn't manage the taxes on the main house alone. He said it was what Dad would have wanted. He didn't mention the $3 million offer he had already received for the family estate. He didn't mention the gambling debts Mark had accumulated. He only talked about her comfort. Maggie looked at the silver compass in her hand. She felt the weight of it. It was the only thing they hadn't tried to take yet. Probably because they thought it was a piece of junk. They didn't see the value in things that didn't have a price tag. The bank had sent her a notice that morning. She had $48.12 left in her personal account. Everything else was tied up in the probate battle. The children had frozen the credit cards. They had even stopped the gardener from coming to the house. The silence in the room grew heavy. Mr. Vance pulled a thick, cream-colored envelope from his briefcase. It was sealed with red wax. He set it in the center of the table. He told the children that their father had left specific instructions for this exact meeting. He said the envelope could only be opened once the children had signed the formal contest of the will. Stephen snatched the pen. He signed his name in a single, aggressive motion. Linda and Mark followed. Chloe was the last to sign. She looked at her mother for a fleeting second, then looked away. They had done it. They had officially declared their mother a ward of the estate. They had taken the towers, the trucks, and the house. Maggie didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply watched the ink dry on the paper. She knew something they didn't. She knew that Arthur Sullivan was a man of his word, and he had promised her that as long as she had the compass, she would never be lost. The door clicked shut behind the secretary. Margaret Sullivan was 74 years old, and for the first time in her life, she felt like a ghost in her own story. She sat in the high-backed chair and smoothed the fabric of her skirt. The wool was thinning at the knees. She had intended to buy a new suit last year, but Mark had needed help with his youngest son's tuition. She had given him the money without a second thought. She had always given, without a second thought. It was the rhythm of her life. She remembered the smell of diesel and stale coffee from the early years of the marriage. She had been 21 years old and 3 weeks away from starting her degree in mathematics when Arthur's first truck engine blew. The repair cost exactly what her first semester's tuition would have been. She took her enrollment check to the mechanic instead of the registrar. She never looked back. For the next decade, she ran the business from a card table in the corner of their bedroom. She tracked every gallon of fuel and every mile of road while the children slept. She was the one who spotted the billing errors that saved them from bankruptcy in the winter of '82. She was the one who stayed up until dawn to ensure the drivers were paid on time. She did all of this without a title or a corner office. To her children, she was the person who made the sandwiches and found the lost shoes. They never saw the ink stains on her fingers at midnight. They never saw the way her eyes strained under the low light of a single desk lamp while she balanced the ledgers. When Stephen wanted to join the elite rowing club, she cancelled her own medical checkups for a year to cover the fees. She told Arthur she simply felt healthy that year and didn't need the doctor. When Linda needed the designer dress for the debutante ball, Maggie stayed up for 3 nights straight. She altered a second-hand gown she found in a charity shop until it looked like it came from a Parisian runway. She never told Linda where it really came from. She wanted them to feel like they belonged in the world she was building for them. She wanted them to have the confidence she had traded away for their sake. She had trusted Arthur completely. He was a man of the road, but she was the one who kept the map. They had built the Sullivan name on a foundation of her silence and his sweat. She never asked to be on the deeds, because she thought a marriage was a sanctuary, not a contract. She believed that the house they lived in belonged to the life they had shared. She believed the children she had raised with such care would remember the nights she spent sitting by their beds when they were sick. She thought love was a form of equity that only grew over time. She reached into her pocket and felt the silver compass. It was heavy and cold. Arthur had found it in an antique shop in a small coastal town during their only vacation in 30 years. He told her it was a tool for people who knew where they were going. He had used a pocket knife to scratch a set of coordinates into the back. He told her that if everything else fell away, those numbers would lead her home. She hadn't looked at the coordinates in decades. She had been too busy looking at school schedules and corporate tax returns. But now, as she looked at her children, she realized the home she thought she knew was gone. The children were tall and polished now. They wore the success she had paid for like a suit of armor. Stephen had his father's chin, but none of his warmth. Linda had Maggie's eyes, but they were fixed on the legal documents. They were discussing her life as if she were a piece of aging machinery that had become too expensive to maintain. They talked about the cost of the estate's heating. They talked about the liability of the old swimming pool. They never talked about the woman who had filled that pool with a garden hose while they laughed and splashed in the sun. Maggie looked at the clock on the wall. The second hand moved with a quiet, relentless click. She thought about her daily routine before Arthur passed. She would wake up at 5 in the morning to make his coffee. She would read the financial news and mark the sections he needed to see. She would walk to the small bakery at the end of the street to buy his favorite rolls. It was a simple life, built on the steady heartbeat of service. She didn't mind the work. She didn't mind the early hours. She had been happy to be the anchor, but anchors are only useful when the ship wants to stay in one place. Her children were ready to sail, and they wanted to cut the rope. They saw her as a weight. They saw her memories as a burden on the balance sheet. She looked down at her hands. They were spotted with age, but still strong. These were the hands that had built an empire from a kitchen table. She took a deep breath. The air in the office was thin and dry. She felt the silver compass one more time. It was the only thing in the room that felt real. Stephen leaned back in his leather chair and checked his gold watch for the 3rd time. The afternoon sun cut through the vertical blinds in sharp, clinical strips. He reached across the mahogany desk and nudged a framed photograph of Maggie and Arthur toward the edge. He placed his espresso cup exactly where the photo had been. It was a small movement, but it felt like he was clearing a shelf. "We're just being realistic, Mum," Linda said, her voice soft and rehearsed. "At your age, you simply can't manage 20 bedrooms and 5 acres of garden alone. We're worried about you." She didn't look worried. She looked like she was mentally measuring the curtains in the west wing for her own living room. Mark nodded in agreement, his fingers tapping a rhythmic beat on the table. He was already wearing the heavy signet ring that Arthur had promised to wear until the day he died. He had taken it from the bedside table before the funeral director had even arrived. "It's a clean break," Stephen added, sliding a final stack of papers toward her. "This is what's best for everyone. You'll be so much more comfortable in the suite we looked at in the city. It has a 2-4-hour medical staff and a beautiful view of the park." Maggie looked at the papers. They were thick with legal speak and fine print. She knew what they were doing. They were using the law to erase her. They were turning her 40 years of labor into a line item titled Administrative Support. "I built that company with your father," Maggie said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Mark let out a short, sharp laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Mum, let's be honest. You were essentially just the secretary with a ring on your finger. Dad made the deals. You just did the math." The room went very still. Mr. Vance, the solicitor, looked down at his blotter. Even Linda seemed to flinch at the bluntness of the words, but Mark didn't take them back. He just shrugged and reached for the silver carafe of water. The family mansion to Stephen, the investment portfolio to Linda, the logistics empire to Mark and Chloe, while they exchanged glances of quiet triumph, already spending the millions they hadn't earned. Margaret received what they called the legacy. It was a decommissioned stone lighthouse on a jagged cliff called Gray's Point, and a sealed cream envelope that smelled of old tobacco. "The lighthouse is a tax burden, really," Chloe said, finally speaking up. "But it's been in the Sullivan line for 100 years. Since you love the outdoors so much, we thought it was a fair trade. It's peace and quiet, Mum. Isn't that what you always said you wanted?" Maggie looked at the heavy silver compass in her pocket. She felt the coordinates scratched into the back pressing against her palm. She thought about the nights she had spent balancing the books while Chloe slept in silk sheets. She thought about the medical bills she had hidden so Arthur wouldn't worry. She looked at her 4 children, the people she had breathed life into, and she realized they were strangers. "Is that all?" Maggie asked. "Just sign the last page, Mom," Stephen said. He handed her a fountain pen. It was a gift she had bought him for his graduation. "We've already arranged the movers for the house. They'll be there on Monday morning. We've kept a few boxes of your clothes and the personal things." Maggie took the pen. The metal felt cold. She signed her name with a steady hand. She didn't look at the dollar amounts. She didn't look at the lists of properties. She only looked at the word lighthouse. Mr. Vance picked up the sealed envelope Arthur had left. He handed it to her across the table. His eyes held a flicker of something that looked like a warning, or perhaps a hope. The children didn't care about the envelope. They were already standing up, checking their phones, and discussing dinner reservations at a place Maggie couldn't afford. "I'll take the lighthouse," Maggie said. She stood up and buttoned her charcoal coat. She didn't wait for them to offer her a ride. She didn't wait for a hug that wouldn't be sincere. She walked out of the office and into the cold afternoon air. The silver compass was heavy in her pocket. The envelope was tucked under her arm. She walked toward the bus stop. The bus stop was a rusted metal bench bolted to a concrete slab. Margaret Sullivan sat on the edge of the cold slats and watched the evening traffic crawl past in a river of red brake lights. The wind coming off the city streets carried the smell of exhaust and damp pavement. She reached into her handbag and pulled out her wallet. It was a cracked, leather billfold she had owned since 1994. She opened it and counted the contents. She had $48.12 in her checking account. She had $6.50 in cash. This was the sum total of 50 years of bookkeeping for a multi-million-dollar corporation. This was the price of 4 university degrees and a lifetime of silent service. She looked at the plastic bank card in its slot. It felt like a useless piece of scrap. She knew the children would have already notified the bank of the guardianship papers. By tomorrow morning, even the $48 might be gone. She took out her phone. The screen was a slab of dark glass. She pressed the home button. The battery was at 22%. There were no missed calls. There were no text messages from Linda asking if she had made it home. There was no apology from Mark. The last notification was a calendar reminder for a dentist appointment she could no longer afford to keep. She looked at the names in her contact list. Stephen, Linda, Mark, Chloe. They were just words on a screen now. They were labels for people who had decided she was a liability to be managed. She put the phone back in her bag. She didn't call anyone. She didn't have a sister to cry to or a friend with a spare room. She had spent 40 years building a family, and in doing so, she had forgotten to build a world outside of it. She was 74 years old, and she was standing on the edge of a map she didn't recognize. Maggie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the silver compass. She held it in the palm of her hand. The metal was dull in the yellow glow of the street lamp. She turned it over and looked at the back. The coordinates were scratched deep into the silver. 41 degrees, 32 minutes, north. 70 degrees, 51 minutes, west. She didn't need a map to know where those numbers led. Arthur had taken her there once, decades ago, before the trucks and the towers. They had stood on a jagged cliff and watched the Atlantic Ocean churn against the rocks. He had told her that the lighthouse was the family's first real asset. He had told her it was the only thing that would never change. She looked at the bus schedule pinned to the side of the shelter. The last bus to the coast left in 20 minutes. The ticket cost $12.50. If she bought it, she would have $35 left in the world. She would have a decommissioned stone tower and a sealed envelope she was too afraid to open yet. She thought about the city apartment the children had picked for her. She thought about the white walls and the 24-hour medical staff. She thought about the way they would visit her once a month and talk over her head about their busy lives. She thought about the silence of a life where she was no longer needed. She stood up from the bench. Her knees cracked with a dry, physical sound. She felt a sharp pain in her lower back that had been her constant companion since the funeral. She ignored it. She walked to the ticket kiosk and slid her $6 across the counter. She used her debit card for the rest. The machine whirred and spat out a thin strip of thermal paper. She had $35.62. She didn't go back to the mansion to pack a suitcase. She didn't want the clothes they had picked for her. She didn't want the memories that were now stained with the ink of the solicitor's pen. She had her coat. She had her compass. She had the envelope. The bus pulled up to the curb with a hiss of air brakes. The driver didn't look at her as she climbed the steps. She found a seat at the very back and pressed her forehead against the glass of the window. The city lights began to blur as the bus accelerated. She watched her reflection in the dark pane. She looked like a stranger. She was still here. Margaret Sullivan was 74 years old when she stepped off the bus into the salt air of Blackwood Cove. It was 4 in the morning. The sky was the color of a bruised plum. The town consisted of a single main road that ended at the Atlantic Ocean. She saw a gas station with 2 rusted pumps and a diner with faded checkered curtains. A neon sign for a local beer hummed in the window. An old man in a grease-stained canvas jacket was locking the pump handles. He stopped when he saw her standing there with nothing but a handbag and a sealed envelope. He didn't ask her for a ticket or a reason for being there. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at the silver chain, hanging from her coat pocket. "You're Margaret," he said. His voice sounded like gravel shifting in a pan. "Elias Thorne. I worked the probate records for 40 years. Arthur told me to watch for a woman who looked like she could find her way through a storm." Maggie nodded. She didn't have the strength for a long conversation. Elias pointed a gnarled finger toward a jagged ridge of rock half a mile down the coast. He told her the path was steep, but the stone was solid. He didn't offer her a ride, and she didn't ask for one. The walk took 40 minutes. Every step sent a jolt of pain through her swollen knees. The wind came off the water in cold, wet sheets. When she finally reached the top of the ridge, she saw Gray's Point. The lighthouse was worse than the children had described. The white paint had been stripped away by decades of salt and wind. The stone base was covered in dark green moss that looked like a spreading rot. The iron gallery at the top was rusted into orange lace. It looked like a skeleton guarding a graveyard. Maggie stood at the base of the tower. She felt the $35 in her pocket. She felt the weight of her 74 years. She almost turned back. She almost walked back to the bus station to wait for the morning ride to the city apartment. Then she saw the door. It was a heavy slab of salt-bleached oak. The wood was silvered and cracked, but the iron handle was different. It was polished to a dull shine. There was no rust on the hinges. Someone had been maintaining the entry to this ruin while the rest of the world let it crumble. She reached out and turned the handle. The door clicked open. The interior of the lighthouse smelled of wet stone and dead centuries. Margaret stood in the center of the circular room and watched a single drop of water fall from the vaulted ceiling. It landed on the dusty floor with a sound that seemed to echo up the spiral staircase. She didn't have a flashlight. She didn't have a match. She only had the grey light of a coastal dawn filtering through a salt-crusted window. She spent the first 3 days moving in slow, rhythmic circles. Her hands were stiff from the cold. Her knuckles were swollen like knots in an old rope. She used a discarded piece of slate to scrape the thickest layers of moss from the walls. She found a rusted bucket behind the stairs and used it to catch the leaks. Every time she bent down to empty it, a sharp, electric pain shot through her lower back. She had to hold onto the stone wall for a full minute before she could stand straight again. She had no bed. She slept on a pile of old canvas sails she found in a storage chest on the second floor. They were stiff with brine and smelled of mildew. She wrapped herself in her charcoal wool coat and listened to the wind howl through the iron gallery above. The sound was a low, mournful whistle that never stopped. It was the sound of a house that had forgotten how to be lived in. She ate crackers she had bought at the gas station and drank water from a rusted tap that groaned every time she turned it. By the 4th day, her legs felt heavy, like they were filled with wet sand. She sat on the bottom step of the stairs and looked at her hands. They were covered in small nicks and grey dust. She thought about the executive boardrooms where her sons were currently sitting. She thought about the climate-controlled offices and the leather chairs. She took out her phone. The battery icon was a thin red sliver, 4%. She opened her messages one last time. There was nothing. No, are you okay? No. Where did you go? There was only a notification from her bank. Her account had been restricted. Her $35 were now inaccessible. She looked at the stone walls around her. She thought, I cannot fix a leaky roof. I am 74 years old with $0 and I cannot fix a stone wall. The math of her survival was a ledger that simply wouldn't balance. This was the place where she would stop. She would lay down on the canvas sails and wait for the cold to take the rest of her. She felt the silver compass in her pocket. It was the only thing that didn't feel like it was rotting. She pulled it out and looked at the scratched coordinates on the back. Her fingers traced the lines Arthur had carved. So many years ago. A shadow fell across the doorway. Elias Thorne stood there holding a small wooden crate. He didn't ask her how she was doing. He didn't offer her a room in town. He walked inside and set it down. The crate on the floor. It contained a loaf of bread, a tin of kerosene, and a heavy wool blanket that smelled of cedar. The wind's shifting, Elias said. He looked at the slate Maggie had used to scrape the walls. You missed a spot near the hearth. There's a flue that needs clearing if you want to stay warm. He didn't wait for a thank you. He turned and walked back out into the mist. Maggie looked at the bread. She looked at the kerosene. She looked at the silver compass in her hand. The glass face caught a stray beam of light from the window and threw a bright, defiant spark against the dark stone. She stood up. Her knees screamed, but she didn't sit back down. She grabbed the rusted bucket and threw the grey water out the door. She wasn't dying in a city apartment with white walls and a nurse. She wasn't dying because her children thought. She was a line item on a budget. She was 74 years old, and she still knew how to count. She went back to the wall and started scraping. The rain began at midnight. It wasn't a soft drizzle, but a heavy, rhythmic drumming that made the stone walls of the lighthouse sweat. Margaret Sullivan sat on the floor by the cold hearth and held the silver compass in her right hand. The metal had warmed to the temperature of her skin. She looked at the coordinates scratched into the back one more time. 41 degrees, 32 minutes. North, 70 degrees, 51 minutes. West. She remembered what Elias had said about the flue. She picked up a rusted iron poker and reached into the dark mouth of the fireplace. The soot was thick and smelled of ancient fires. She scraped at the back wall of the hearth. The iron made a dull thudding sound against the stone, except for one spot. Near the base of the chimney, the sound changed. It was a hollow metallic ring. Maggie dropped to her knees. The sharp pain in her joints was a distant static. She used the edge of the silver compass to scrape away the accumulated grime between two large granite blocks. Her hands began to shake. She had to stop and take a breath that felt like it wouldn't quite reach the bottom of her lungs. She cleared more soot. There was a small iron ring recessed into the stone. She hooked her finger through the ring and pulled. The stone didn't move at first. She braced her feet against the hearth and pulled again with everything her 74-year-old frame had left. The block slid forward with a grinding screech. Behind it was a cavity lined with cedar wood. Inside the cavity sat a heavy metal dispatch box and a second cream-colored envelope. Maggie pulled the box onto the floor. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wiped her blackened hands on her coat and reached for the latch. It wasn't locked. The lid creaked open to reveal a stack of documents bound in blue ribbon. She picked up the first page. The paper was crisp and smelled of wax. She read the heading, then she read it again. Her eyes moved slowly across the lines of precise legal script. Irrevocable trust of the Sullivan Logistics founders. She turned the page. Her breath hitched in her throat. She saw her own name, not as a beneficiary, not as a ward. She saw her name listed as the sole and primary trustee with absolute veto power over all corporate assets. She put the paper down on the dusty floor. She picked it up and read it a third time. She looked for the date. It had been signed 10 years ago. It had been witnessed by Elias Thorne and a notary from a town 3 states away. She reached deeper into the box and found a ledger. It wasn't a corporate book. It was a personal record in Arthur's handwriting. He had kept a second set of books for 40 years. He had recorded every hour she spent at the kitchen table. He had documented every dollar she had saved the company during the recession. He had assigned a market value to her administrative support, and then he had moved that value into a private offshore holding company. "I told you I'd find the way home, Arthur," she whispered to the empty, echoing room. She picked up the second envelope. It wasn't a will. It was a deed, but it wasn't for the lighthouse. It was a deed for the land beneath the main family mansion. The children owned the house, but according to the document in her hand, Margaret Sullivan owned the earth it sat on. She owned the driveway. She owned the gardens. She owned the very air the house occupied. She looked at the silver compass. The coordinates weren't for the lighthouse location on a map. They were the measurements for the hidden compartment in the hearth. 5 inches up, 2 inches over, north and west, from the center stone. She sat in the dark for a long time. The rain continued to fall. The wind continued to howl. But for the first time in 3 months, the silence inside the tower didn't feel like a grave. It felt like a fortress. She knew exactly what she had to do. The compass clicked shut. The next 3 weeks were a blur of lime wash, linseed oil, and the sharp scent of iron scrubbed clean. Margaret Sullivan did not leave the lighthouse to find a hotel. She did not use the documents in the dispatch box to fly to a tropical island. She stayed on the cliff. She used the $48.12 to buy a heavy-duty scrub brush, a bucket of whitewash, and a box of high-calorie protein bars. She worked from the first light of dawn until her hands could no longer grip the handle. She started with the glass. The lantern room at the top of the tower was encased in 24 panels of thick, salt-caked crystal. For 3 days, she climbed the spiral staircase with a bucket of vinegar and water. She spent hours on her knees, reaching for the corners. She scrubbed until the crust of decades began to flake away. Beneath the grime, the glass was still perfect. When the sun finally hit the panes on the 4th afternoon, the tower didn't just catch the light, it fractured it into 1,000 dancing diamonds. It fractured it into 1,000 dancing diamonds that raced across the stone floor. Maggie stood in the center of the light and watched the dust motes dance. She didn't feel like a ghost anymore. Next, she turned her attention to the iron. The gallery railing was thick with orange rust that came off in jagged scales. She used a wire brush and a metal file. Every stroke sent a vibration through her arms that made her teeth ache. Her shoulders burned with a steady, throbbing heat. Her lower back felt like a bridge that was slowly buckling under a heavy load. She ignored the pain. She painted the iron a deep, midnight black. The paint was thick and smelled of chemicals, but it covered the decay. By the end of the 2nd week, the skeleton of the lighthouse began to look like a fortress again. She didn't do it all alone. Elias Thorne arrived every other morning in his rusted pickup truck. He never asked to be paid. He brought sacks of coal for the small cast-iron stove she had found in the cellar. He brought a gallon of fresh water and a bag of apples. One morning, he arrived with a heavy crate of salvaged timber. He showed Maggie how to measure the gaps in the floorboards. He watched as she hammered the first nail. He didn't offer to do it for her. He knew she needed the weight of the hammer in her own hand. The stone walls were the hardest. They had absorbed the dampness of the ocean for 50 years. Maggie mixed the lime wash in a plastic tub. She applied it with a wide, flat brush. The white liquid filled the cracks and smoothed the edges. The interior of the tower began to brighten. The shadows retreated into the corners. She found a discarded wooden table in the town's communal scrap heap and dragged it up the path. She sanded the surface until the grain of the oak reappeared. She placed the silver compass in the center of the table. It was the only decoration in the room. The transformation was quiet but absolute. The ruin was becoming a home. She cleared the dead vines from the base of the tower. She found a small patch of dirt protected by a stone ledge. She planted 3 rows of hardy sea kale and a handful of marigold seeds she bought at the gas station. She carried water from the tower to the dirt every evening. The work was hard, physical, and repetitive. It was exactly what she needed. It grounded her. It reminded her that she was still a woman who could build things. The environment began to mirror her progress. The storm clouds that had sat on the horizon for weeks finally broke. The air turned crisp and clear. The smell of mold was replaced by the scent of wood smoke and salt air. The tower didn't look like a grave anymore. It looked like a beacon. The whitewashed walls caught the moonlight and turned the cliffside into a landmark. People in town started to notice. They saw the black iron of the gallery standing sharp against the blue sky. They saw the smoke rising from the chimney. They knew the woman from the bus hadn't left. Maggie looked at the lighthouse one evening from the bottom of the ridge. The stone was bright. The iron was dark. The glass was clear. She felt the weight of the silver compass in her pocket. She thought about the documents in the dispatch box. She thought about the corporation she had built and the house she had lost. None of it felt as real as the ache in her muscles. None of it felt as valuable as the whitewashed walls of the tower. She was 74 years old, and she had built a sanctuary with her own 2 hands. She went inside and closed the oak door. The first time Margaret felt something close to peace, it wasn't an emotional declaration. It was the physical sensation of the sun warming the back of her neck while she weeded the sea kale. The soil was cool and damp against her palms. She realized she hadn't looked at her dead phone in 4 days. She didn't know the time, and for the first time in 50 years, the lack of a schedule didn't make her heart race. She was 74 years old, and she was no longer waiting for a phone to ring or a child to call. She went inside and picked up the silver compass from the oak table. She polished the glass with the hem of her apron. She looked at the scratched coordinates on the back and spoke to the empty, whitewashed room. "I'm still here, Arthur," she said. Her voice was steady and clear. "The roof is tight and the glass is clean. I think I finally understand why you kept this place secret." She didn't cry. She simply set the compass back down and felt the weight of her own presence. By the second month, the community began to arrive. They didn't come because they felt sorry for her. They came because the white tower on the ridge had become a landmark again. A young woman named Sarah from the gas station started walking up the path on Tuesday afternoons. She brought a thermos of tea and sat on the stone steps while Maggie polished the brass fittings. Sarah was 24 and worked 2 jobs to support a younger brother. She told Maggie about the bills that never seemed to end. She talked about the weight of being the one who remembered everything. Maggie didn't give her a lecture on resilience. She didn't tell her it would get easier. She simply handed Sarah a spare rag and showed her how to find the grain in the metal. They worked in a shared, rhythmic silence. Maggie taught her how to balance a household ledger on the back of a grocery receipt. She showed her how to spot the small leaks in a life. They were 2 women from different generations, recognizing the same calloused skin on their hands. Others followed. The local fisherman, Captain Miller, left a crate of fresh mackerel at the base. He told her he used the reflection of the lighthouse glass to find the harbor entrance in the morning fog. He didn't call it charity. He called it a professional courtesy to the keeper. 2 school teachers came to ask if they could bring a class of children to see the historic stonework. Maggie opened the oak door and stood aside. She watched the children run their hands over granite. She heard them whisper about the lady who lived in the sky. The town didn't see a discarded widow. They saw a woman who had reclaimed a ruin. They saw the black iron gallery and the whitewashed walls, and they saw a purpose. Maggie began to realize that her value wasn't something her children could take away in a lawyer's office. Her value was in her hands. It was in the way she moved through the tower. It was in the way she looked at the horizon without fear. She was no longer the secretary with a ring on her finger. She was the keeper of Gray's Point. She spent her evenings sitting on the gallery railing. The wind was a constant companion, but it no longer felt like a threat. The light from the setting sun turned the Atlantic into a sheet of beaten gold. The air smelled of pine. She felt a quiet, solid strength settling into her bones. She wasn't building a kingdom for someone else anymore. She was building a life that fit her own measurements. One evening, Elias Thorne climbed the path and sat on the stone ledge near her garden. He looked at the marigolds that were finally beginning to bloom. He looked at the white tower standing, tall against the darkening sky. He didn't say much. He just nodded toward the road that led back to the city. "They're talking about the lighthouse in the city papers, Margaret," Elias said. "The Historical Society wants to know who did the restoration. Your son Stephen called the diner yesterday asking for directions." Maggie didn't flinch. She didn't look toward the road. She just kept her eyes on the gold light on the water. She reached into her pocket and felt the silver compass. She knew they would come. She knew greed always found its way toward something beautiful. But she also knew the door was made of oak and the walls were 3 feet thick. "Let them come," Maggie said. She stood up and went inside to prepare for the morning light. The black SUV pulled up at the base of the ridge on a Tuesday afternoon. Stephen climbed out first. He wore a tailored navy suit that cost more than the lighthouse's annual taxes. Linda and Mark followed him. They stood at the bottom of the path and looked up at the whitewashed tower with a mixture of surprise and calculation. They didn't see a home. They saw an asset that had appreciated significantly in 60 days. They climbed the path slowly. Their expensive leather shoes slipped on the loose gravel. Maggie stood on the gallery railing and watched them ascend. She didn't wave. She didn't go down to meet them. She waited until they reached the heavy oak door. When she finally stepped down the spiral stairs, she found them crowded into her living room. They looked like bright, polished birds in a stone cage. "Mum, you look wonderful," Linda said. She reached out as if to hug her, then pulled back at the sight of Maggie's work-worn apron. "The air here must be doing you wonders. We were so worried when you didn't answer our calls." Maggie looked at her daughter. She remembered the 0 missed calls on her phone during those first freezing nights. She didn't point it out. She just poured 4 cups of tea into mismatched ceramic mugs. "We saw the article in the city paper," Stephen said. He stepped toward the sanded oak table and picked up the silver compass. He turned it over in his hands. "A masterful restoration," they called it. "We're so proud of what you've done here, Mum. We're just being realistic, though. This place is far too isolated for you to manage long-term. It's a historical landmark now," Mark added. He was eyeing the dispatch box on the shelf. "The board thinks we should incorporate the lighthouse into the logistics group's branding. It would be a tribute to Dad. This is what's best for everyone." Maggie took the compass from Stephen's hand. She placed it back in the center of the table. "Why are you here, Stephen?" Maggie asked. Stephen hesitated. He pulled a thin folder from his leather briefcase. "There's a small clerical error in the mansion's deed. A formality, really. It seems the land title wasn't properly transferred during the probate. We need your signature to clear it up so we can finalize the sale." He pushed the paper toward her. He used his most caring, professional voice. He told her the money from the sale would ensure she had the best private care for the rest of her life. He said it was a clean break. He said it was for her own safety. Maggie didn't look at the paper. She looked at her eldest son. "Your father knew you would come for the dirt," Maggie said. Her voice was as cold and clear as the Atlantic. "He knew you would value the walls and forget the foundation. That's why he left the land to me." The room went silent. Mark shifted his weight, his boots scuffing the floor she had scrubbed on her hands and knees. "Mum, don't make this harder than it needs to be," Linda said. "You're 74 years old. You can't start a legal war over a driveway." "I'm not starting a war," Maggie said. "I'm finishing a ledger. I've read the irrevocable trust, Stephen. I know I have the power to veto every board decision you've made since the funeral. I know about the offshore holding company Arthur built for me." Stephen's face turned a dull, angry red. "You were essentially just the help, Mum. You don't understand how the business works." "I understand that the business is built on my silence," Maggie said, "and I am no longer silent. You can keep the trucks and the towers, but the house stays empty, and the land stays mine." She walked to the oak door and held it open. The wind rushed into the room, smelling of salt and finality. "We're your children," Chloe whispered, from the back of the group. "Then act like it," Maggie said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She stood as steady as the granite walls around her. She watched them walk back down the path. Their expensive cars looked small and fragile from the height of the ridge. They didn't look back. The door clicked shut. 6 months after the morning, the black SUV disappeared down the ridge. The sun rose over Gray's Point and turned the white stone into a pillar of salt and fire. Margaret Sullivan walked out onto the gallery railing. She wore a new navy blue wool sweater. It was thick and warm. She had bought it with the first dividend check from the Sullivan Trust. The legal battle had been short and decisive. When the irrevocable trust documents were filed in open court, the children's lawyers had gone silent. The paper trail Arthur had left was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. It proved that Maggie had been the silent architect of the empire for 40 years. Stephen had stepped down as CEO within 30 days of the hearing. Linda and Mark were now minority shareholders with no voting rights. They had tried to call her 3 times in the last month. Maggie hadn't picked up the phone. She didn't need to hear their apologies. She knew they were only sorry that they had been caught. The family mansion on the hill was no longer a trophy for sale. Maggie had used the trust to convert the estate into a coastal heritage centre and a retreat for retired bookkeepers. She kept the deed to the land and the lighthouse for herself. She spent her mornings in the lantern room and her afternoons in the garden. The sea kale was flourishing. The marigolds had created a bright orange ring around the base. Elias Thorne walked up the path carrying a small wooden crate of supplies. He didn't knock. He simply set the crate on the oak table and joined her on the gallery. They stood together in the salt air and watched the fishing boats head out to the deep water. There was no talk of boardrooms or bank balances. They talked about the weather and the price of fresh bait. Maggie reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver compass. She held it in the palm of her hand and watched the needle settle. The glass was polished to a high shine. The scratched coordinates on the back were a reminder of a man who loved her enough to protect her from the children they had raised together. She looked out at the horizon where the blue water met the grey sky. "The books finally balance, Arthur," she whispered. She went back inside and closed the door. "This story proves that your value is not determined by the people who fail to see it. It proves that justice doesn't always arrive with a shout. Sometimes it arrives with a quiet woman. Sometimes it arrives with a quiet woman in a grey coat who knows how to read the fine print." Margaret Sullivan didn't just reclaim her money. She reclaimed her name. If Maggie's story moved you, if you've ever felt invisible while building a dream for people who didn't deserve it, this story was for you. Leave one word in the comments describing the moment the dispatch box was opened, because Maggie's story proves something that is always true. The truth is a map that always leads you exactly where you belong. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their worth is not a line item on someone else's budget, because together we prove that dreams don't age.